Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 29th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, on disaster response, everyone seems to agree something needs to change. So why hasn't anything changed? Plus, the Postal Service has gotten the green light to take on more government services. So far, it has not. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Food insecurity is on the rise among military families, and more than a third of currently serving families say they have less than $500 in savings. Those are some of the findings of the Military Family Advisory Network's biennial survey. Over the years, the survey, which is the largest independent research effort focused on the military family population, has helped shape major policy and quality of life reforms. For more on this year's survey, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Dr. Gabby L'Esperance, Military Family Advisory Network's Vice President of Research and Evaluation.
We do the Military Family 360 survey every 2 years at the Military Family Advisory Network. Our goal is always to understand the lived experiences of military families over the past 2 years. In this iteration, we took a really hard look at well-being and readiness, wanting to understand how military family readiness impacts force readiness. We took a broad-ranging look at everything from healthcare and food security to housing choices and invisible family load. And that instrument really gives us an in-depth look at the experiences of military families. And this year, specifically focusing in on those currently serving and enlisted families who make up more than 70% of the survey population. For those enlisted families, it's 80.4%.
What are some of the biggest findings or some of the most important takeaways from this year's survey? And then similarly, the last survey you conducted in 2023, what are some of the biggest changes that stood out to you?
I would say the biggest takeaway from the survey this year isn't a single statistic. It's the fact that the findings show how interconnected military family experiences are. None of the things a family experiences, whether that's healthcare access or food security or housing burden, exist in a silo. All of them are interconnected and paint a complex picture of military family readiness. And when we talk about the biggest takeaways, right, report really proves that military readiness starts with family readiness. Everything from increased rates of food security, increased rates of housing burden, increased rates of mental health care need. All of these things are demonstrated throughout the report and interact with one another, but really form the bedrock of force readiness as military service members rely on their families and their support systems to navigate this life. We also saw that military spouses, particularly those with children, continue to shoulder extraordinary responsibility across multiple domains. We see that in childcare. We see that in spouse unemployment rates growing. We see that for the first time this year in the Invisible Family Load Score, which showed that military spouses carry a disproportionate load in comparison to some service members. And we also saw that these military family challenges are compounding. We see a PCS every 2 to 3 years. And with that comes high out-of-pocket costs, bringing your family to a new location, having to reestablish employment for a military spouse, find new childcare for military children. All of these things compound over time.
Let's zero in on some of those issues. One of the report's key findings is that military spouses, particularly those with children, reported some of the most negative outcomes across multiple measures. What did the survey find when it comes to military spouses, and how does it compare to the 2023 survey?
If we were going to pay attention to one population in this report, I would really encourage folks to look at those military spouses. To your point, they're experiencing challenges above and beyond what we've seen in previous years. We also know that they're the folks managing the day-to-day life of military families. They're carrying an invisible load, and some of that load is just part of functioning. It's the planning, the coordinating, the work that often goes unseen as military families navigate this life. And much of that is functioning. Some of it is even rewarding and meaningful. But when we see those things compound into what is a higher invisible load score, we see some negative outcomes across family health and well-being. And that shows up across many areas of the report, right? Employment, childcare, community, family functioning, all of those things really co-locate around the military spouse and their role in the family. And so we would encourage people to really take a close look at that population and how we can best serve them. When it comes to recommending military life, we see that active duty spouses are least likely to recommend military life, about 50%. And so addressing some of these well-being needs of military spouses really is both a recruitment and a retention narrative.
One of the things that stood out to me in the mental health section, it said that military spouses were among the highest, reporting that they had suicidal ideations. Could you speak to that part?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw across the mental health section this year some interesting data around the idea that families are more willing to seek mental health support across the board. We also saw, unfortunately, that military spouses were the most likely in their family unit to experience suicidal ideation and the most likely people in the family to go to an emergency room for mental health care support when they're unable to access an appointment. Those statistics are both concerning and startling to see that families are turning more and more towards the emergency room. For half of the folks that had used the emergency room for mental health care support in the last 2 years, 50% had done so multiple times. And it goes to the healthcare access and mental health care access specifically data that we see in the report. But when we think about military spouses and the weight that they're carrying across that invisible load score and compare that to their need for mental health support and the suicidal ideation, it paints a really clear picture about the need to address their well-being.
Did the same issue come up in the 2023 survey?
We did not see that trend in the 2023 survey, no.
I also wanted to zero in on food insecurity because something that really stood out to me from the report is that in 2025, around 40% of respondents said that they were experiencing low or very low food insecurity. And that is up from 15.6% across the full population. So that was in 2023. We went from 15% to 41%. Also, you write in the report that many respondents said that they're skipping meals or portions of meals so that other family members can eat. How do you explain such a spike?
So our survey was fielded from October to January of that 25 to 2026 New Year season, which coincided with a government shutdown and emergency response support from MVAN. Nevertheless, when we look at our food security numbers, we see an upward trend, but we see that in many other areas of the financial security section of the report broadly. We see that in financial well-being. We see it in housing burden. We see it in emergency savings, those who have experienced a financial emergency in the past 2 years. And so the trend is certainly growing, that families are having a more and more difficult time with finances, of which food insecurity is one symptom. When we looked at the Milburn Institute Financial Wellbeing Scale this year, we saw that about 40% of families are just getting by with their finances. And we see this, again, across many areas. But when we think about food insecurity, for the first time this year, rising grocery prices was a key driver to families being unable to afford balanced meals. This picture grows more and more concerning when we think about the fact that military families, many of whom do not have emergency savings or have less than $500 in emergency savings, also frequently experience financial emergencies. About 50% had experienced a financial emergency in the past 2 years. And so these compounding financial challenges and strains ultimately show up in food insecurity and other financial hardship.
That's Dr. Gabby L'Esperance, Military Family Advisory Network's Vice President of Research and Evaluation, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find the story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, on disaster response, everyone seems to agree that something needs to change. So why hasn't anything changed? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Competing FEMA reorganization proposals are now on the table, and there's actually surprising alignment on what needs to change, but still no final plan. That raises a more urgent question. How ready will the agency be when the next major disaster strikes? Andy Winkler of the Bipartisan Policy Center joins us with a look at what's at stake. Andy, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
FEMA has had a tough 18 months. They were significantly affected by the workforce drawdowns in 2025. They haven't had a confirmed director or administrator. They were in the middle of the government shutdowns, both the government-wide shutdown and the 76-day DHS shutdown. And now they've got the FEMA Review Council report out there and some competing legislation. Tell me, from your perspective, as you've looked at this really kind of across the space, what are the competing visions for what a reformed FEMA should look like and what it should do?
No, that's a great question. And to be fair to FEMA, I think they've had harder than the last 18 months. They've had a rough few years. You know, it's an agency, I think people uniquely know what FEMA is, but they don't exactly know what all FEMA does. And they don't know what all FEMA has been tasked with, which I think is part of the problem. Over the years, their mission has grown and grown and grown without either the workforce or the resources to match the demands that are put on the agency. And so when we think about the problem structurally that it has, managerially that it has, you know, these are longstanding challenges that have only gotten worse over the years. And yes, acutely worse in the last 18 months. I think when we talk about the FEMA Review Council and the legislation that's been proposed in Congress, there's pretty broad sort of alignment on the diagnosis of the problem. We don't always think that, but I think there's actually a lot in common between both of their visions. You know, they both see and agree, I think, that FEMA's programs are administratively burdensome, that disaster assistance coming out of FEMA reaches survivors far, far too slowly, and, you know, that states need greater flexibility and support. How they get to those places, their exact sort of structural changes they're proposing do diverge. And I think that's where we spend a lot of our time thinking about how we can bring what is a pretty broad view that FEMA needs to change to align those specifics on how they get to that change. I think I can go down a few sort of structural differences between, you know, their competing visions, as you would say, of what FEMA's future is.
This seems like a classic public administration case study. And one of the places you could start is its organizational alignment, right? Some have a vision that it stays in DHS. Some have a vision that it would come out and be its own independent agency. From your perspective, what are the pros and cons of both of those options?
I actually think, so you brought up the last 18 months. There's no perfect kind of case study of why, you know, FEMA shouldn't be in DHS. Then over the last 18 months, you know, we saw FEMA funding not really politically divisive, but tied up in broader conversations, political conversations about other sources of funding to DHS. I think that's a great example of some of the challenges that FEMA faces, not always, you know, of its own accord. So when we talk about kind of structural differences, pros, cons between where FEMA sits within the federal government, you know, I think a lot of people that you talk to who have worked at FEMA or who have worked in the federal government sort of recognize that moving FEMA out of DHS could be very difficult. You know, not from any sort of kind of policy reason, other than there are some practical things about sitting with within an agency. You know, who covers the payroll and the technical IT systems you use, and these sort of kind of nitty gritty things that would be operationally difficult to unwind, having had FEMA sit within DHS for so many years. So I think that is one key consideration. It's just mechanically, we don't very often move, sub-agencies out of federal agencies. It's practically difficult. And politically, there are some differences of opinion. Some people see FEMA's alignment with DHS on cybersecurity and other issues that are newer challenges that we face as a country as, beneficial. But then to your point, that we talked about earlier, there are other things like the funding question that kind of show you how FEMA can get tied up with things unrelated to it that actually disrupt its mission and disrupt it from being able to accomplish it. I think there are probably some more there, but those are the big ones.
Andy Winkler is the Managing Director of Housing and Infrastructure Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So let's think about the FEMA Review Council report that's out there, HR 4669. If by some strange stroke of luck we actually could get agreement and legislation on a FEMA reform package, your report makes the point that this is not an overnight transformation, that it is going to take years. What would have to happen, even in the case where we did have an agreement on new mission, alignment, whatever, to actually make the changes?
I mean, I think for one, you have to have a FEMA workforce that has the capacity to help train and get states ready to take on the burden of what it does already. You have a lot of states who I don't think necessarily have done the legwork of a Florida, California, Texas, et cetera, because they haven't had many catastrophic disasters. That doesn't mean they can't have one in the future. It's for most states not a question of will they, it's when will they. And so building that capacity when people don't see the risk, I think is very difficult. And there need to be sort of incentives or, carrots or sticks to get states to where they need to be. And that's a process that takes time when, state budgets are strapped and they have processes that don't go all year. And, these are things to align everything in a perfect way will just take time. Things don't move that quickly.
Let's take the opposite side of that coin. There's a lot of political pressures and a lot of different things for members of Congress to pay attention to. What if we just keep kicking this can down the road and we don't come to an agreed upon position on what FEMA should look like and how it should be structured? What is the impact for future disaster response?
I think the agency, by being in this holding pattern, waiting. First, we were waiting to kind of figure out where the administration stood on a lot of these issues. We were waiting for the FEMA Review Council report. We have the clarity of the administration's position through that report, but we are kind of still in the same place if we think about it. The administration is making some changes. It can administratively. Congress is doing the same thing it usually does. It's giving the money, but it's not really changing the programs. And so as an agency, it has all the same challenges. It's still losing, workers. There's still a lack of clarity around what qualifies as a federally declared disaster, what doesn't, what gets money, what doesn't. There's still burdensome processes for individuals and for localities that are facing a natural disaster. So nothing has changed, and the severity of the challenges that we face will only get worse. We're seeing more wildfires, more devastating hurricanes, all of that. We really need to be prepared and start to think about not just at the federal government, but at every single level from the individual household up.
Do you have a professional prediction on which way it will go?
See, I work at a bipartisan organization, so I'm inherently an optimistic person. I do think, particularly after major disasters, major catastrophes, we have a tendency to regroup and think about what went wrong. If we think about all the past big disaster reform bills, they happened after really big disasters. My concern is I would love to do the hard work to hash out these differences before we wait for a disaster instead of rushing something after we're forced to reckon with the failures of our system. But sometimes that's what it takes to get us to do the right thing.
Andy Winkler is the Managing Director of Housing and Infrastructure Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Andy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Congress seemed close to resolving several key issues last week until the White House stepped in. So what happens now? But first, the Postal Service has the green light to take on more government services. But so far it hasn't. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. With the U.S. Postal Service under financial pressure, expanding into new government services could offer a path forward. But despite having the authority to do more, that effort hasn't moved much beyond passport processing. A new report from the Postal Service's Inspector General points to a lack of strategy and a fragmented approach inside the organization. David Garcia, research analyst with the Postal Service's Office of the Inspector General, is here to walk us through the details. David, it is great to have you back. Nice to see you.
It's nice to be here. Thank you, Terry.
You've got a new report out, and we're going to talk through some options for the Postal Service. But let's start with the Postal Service Reform Act of 2022, because it sets the stage for what you're looking at here. What was in that act, and why was it passed?
Well, that act touched on a number of different ways to improve the Postal Service's financial condition. The piece that's most relevant to this report is that it was enacted in 2022, but it allowed the Postal Service to expand its non-postal government services portfolio beyond the federal level. And what it did is allowed the Postal Service to go on to form partnerships with state, local, and tribal governments. So when we talk about non-postal government services, I'll just give you a little bit of background. So in addition to delivering mail and packages to every address in the country, the Postal Service also partners with government agencies to provide non-postal services. And what these partnerships do is they help agencies provide services to the public, but they can also generate much needed revenue for the Postal Service. So what this report does is it describes the government services that the Postal Service is currently providing, but we also identify a handful of opportunities for the Postal Service to expand its portfolio.
The Postal Service has had this authority since 2022, and it's been pretty challenging, apparently, to diversify that non-postal service portfolio. What's been so challenging about it?
Well, you're right. So actually, the Postal Service has not signed any agreements below the federal level since that legislation went into effect. That said, we spoke to a number of states for this project, and they showed a lot of interest in exploring opportunities with the Postal Service. And they showed interest actually in a handful of areas. So, for example, identity services. To give you an example there, in a lot of states, before essential workers like teachers or nurses can begin work, they have to submit fingerprints and have their identities verified. But if something like this could be done at a local post office, it could really make the process a little bit less cumbersome for these people and more efficient. To give you one more example, federal and state agencies could put self-service kiosks in post offices that let residents complete basic transactions there without actually having to visit a government office. Things like renewing their car registration, or if you lose your registration sticker, going to a post office, using the kiosk, and getting a replacement sticker on site. Or since the Postal Service already visits every address in the country, another possibility is to put sensors in postal vehicles that could generate real-time location-based data for government agencies to monitor a bunch of stuff like road conditions or air quality, wireless signal strength, or really any number of things in a really cost-effective way. And those are just a few examples. There are, I think, a lot of other really neat examples that the paper touches on, but I don't want to give everything away, Terry.
David Garcia is a research analyst in the USPS Office of the Inspector General. All right, David, those kinds of examples seem sort of obvious, like sort of no-brainers, but there's got to be challenges or else we'd be further down the road. What are the biggest obstacles in getting the Postal Service to approach this sort of institutionally?
Yeah, so, the Postal Service does have a government services work group, but right now responsibility for the different phases of the government services life cycle is split across the different components of the agency. So in order to boost this portfolio, the Postal Service could do a couple things. They could create a dedicated team that's responsible for the entire government services life cycle, doing things like business development and engaging with points of contact at other government agencies, to coordinating service delivery across all of the agency's business units. So this way, you would prevent fragmented outreach, and it would also make it easier for the agency to do quality control, making sure that government services are provided consistently across the country. The Postal Service could also create a comprehensive strategic government services plan. That might really help. So we found that some international posts have had success expanding their government services portfolio by doing exactly that. And, these plans would do things like define objectives, define government structures, funding needs, and also operating processes like how to actually identify and evaluate opportunities, because it really is about prioritizing. There are 50 states, I think probably thousands of local government agencies. So it's important to do things like conduct market research and analyze the data to identify the most promising opportunities.
So, David, I have two questions for you based on what you just said. One, the Postmaster General has been very vocal lately, raising the alarm about the Postal Service's financial condition, its precarious financial position. Why isn't that generating more urgency around planning for these kinds of revenue-generating activities?
It's a good question. So, the Postal Service did incorporate this idea in its Delivering for America strategic plan. They do have a work group. And in our paper, we recommended that they go further than that. We suggested that they actually do take steps to create that comprehensive strategic plan and really identify ways to expand the portfolio, because it can generate, much needed additional revenue for the agency. And they did concur with that recommendation.
The second question is just about the Postal Service's capacity. Do they have enough people with the right skills and in the right places to actually do the planning, the outreach, and the implementation?
I think so. So, it's a good question. The law actually requires non-postal government services that the Postal Service provides to do a handful of things. They have to provide a clear public benefit. They cannot interfere with the Postal Service's core duties, like delivering mail 6 days a week. And they also have to cover their costs. In other words, they can't lose money. So, really, it's a win-win. Government services can strengthen the Postal Service's social value, but at the same time, they're not a financial drain on the agency. And like you've alluded to, they can actually, if implemented effectively, generate a lot of much-needed revenue for the agency.
One of the tensions here seems to be between that self-sustaining cost issue that you just raised and the aim of this program, which would be to reach more underserved areas, which may be costly and not generate enough revenue. So how does the Postal Service, or how should the Postal Service think about balancing those two considerations?
Right. So any non-postal service that the Postal Service provides can't lose money. It has to cover its costs. But like you said, providing these non-postal government services can be particularly useful in more remote, underserved, or rural parts of the country where it's more expensive for government agencies to have physical offices. So again, it's sort of a win-win scenario. If the Postal Service actually does market research, proactively reaches out to state and local governments, and identifies places where the need is greatest, in other words, maybe where there's a shortage of actual government offices or where the private sector may not be sufficiently present to provide services, these would be really good opportunities for the Postal Service to step in and fill that gap.
So, David, if the Postal Service is going to move forward and really make this a part of its business plan, You've looked at this inside the organization. What are the one or two things that fundamentally have to change to make it workable?
Well, I think high level, developing, again, a formal and comprehensive plan for growing the government services portfolio, especially at the state and local level, could really help. So I think that's first and foremost. And then, taking it from there, beginning to do proactive research, identifying points of contact at state and local and federal government agencies, reaching out to these people and letting them know about, the services that the Postal Service could provide, getting a sense of where the interest and the need is greatest, and then taking it from there.
David Garcia is a research analyst in the USPS Office of the Inspector General. David, I really appreciate you sharing this report with us today.
I am happy to speak with you, and thanks for the time. And if your listeners would like to check out the full report, they can find it on our website at uspsoig.gov.
We'll post this interview along with, as David just said, the link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, Congress seemed close to resolving several key issues last week until the White House stepped in. So what happens now? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress appeared to be closing in on resolving several major issues last week before the White House shifted the dynamics in a way that could change what comes next. Now lawmakers are reassessing both timing and substance. For a look at where things stand, we turn to Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, great to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
Let's start with housing affordability. We thought we had a bipartisan, bicameral agreement on a big move forward that a lot of people were really interested in. And then at the last minute, we did not. What happened?
This was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever seen on Capitol Hill. You had everything set up in the traditional manner of checks and balances and the way Congress works. You actually had that housing bill passed by the Senate, passed by the House. Everything was all set in place for a big signature from the president last week. Lawmakers from both parties very excited about that. I have not seen such overwhelming bipartisanship for a piece of legislation in quite a long time. So this was seemingly a no-brainer. And that day, just as a personal anecdote, I happened to be giving a couple of people a tour of the Capitol and had told them that the president was coming up on Capitol Hill, so there was going to be some restrictions. As we approached Statuary Hall, where the president was scheduled to sign in front of the cameras and in front of all the lawmakers, this new legislation that's supposed to help people buy a home, help with the supply of the housing, as well as bring down prices. Suddenly, workers with tables just started shooting out of Statuary Hall like missiles coming at us. And I looked at the security person, and he was clearly harried and said, "Please don't go in here. A lot is happening right now." It was only a few minutes later that I found out from some staffers here at the Capitol that the whole thing had been blown up and that the president had decided not to sign the bill. I can't recall a situation where a sitting president, where both of his House and Senate had approved a bill that he was ready to sign, suddenly decided he wasn't going to sign it. And we, of course, know this is because he had a lot of angst related to the fact that the National Voter ID bill, the SAVE Act, has not been passed. So it was just an incredible moment where you could literally see lawmakers were just stunned by what had happened.
Mitchell, let me call you to another bicameral agreement that came under, assault last week. We had both chambers pass a war powers resolution against continuing operations in Iran. And then we didn't. What happened there?
There's more political whiplash there. You're right. So you had fairly straightforward action legislatively. The House had decided to approve yet again a war powers resolution on Iran, effectively blocking additional military action by the president in connection with that. And on the 10th vote in the Senate, there were now enough Republicans joining with Democrats that they finally passed the War Powers Resolution in the Senate. So it appeared that that was finished and that there was essentially a rebuke of the president in connection with this. Then, hours after the signature signing ceremony got canceled, the president met with senators on the Republican side. There was a big tit for tat between Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy and the president, which has been reported upon. And the oddest thing is that after that, really an argument between the two individuals, Bill Cassidy was invited to the White House kind of as a fig leaf, if you will, to be thrown to him. And they briefed him about the war with Iran. And then he came back and they later voted before they left town to take up the War Powers Resolution again. And guess what? Bill Cassidy flipped his vote and there were enough changes that they essentially took back the War Powers Resolution on Iran. Again, something that is virtually unprecedented for something to happen like that.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. The headlines in these two situations are juicy in and of themselves, but more interesting for us here is what does this mean for any work that might try to get done between now and the elections?
Right. So you look at regular order and what happened with the housing bill, and you think, okay, that was supposed to move forward and almost did. And then we're in this little bit of a limbo period. But the implications are that even when everything sets up almost perfectly, there are still problems that happen at the last minute. And in this case, we're now looking at something that is not set up perfectly, and that is the Reconciliation 3.0, the third version of legislation that Republicans are talking about that they want to get across the finish line. And there's really a big amount of difference between Republicans within their conference about whether they think it's going to happen, as the House Speaker thinks it will, or others who are very skeptical about it. And you have the fact that the Pentagon now has added in finally its supplemental request of about $88 billion. And then you have all these different lawmakers with competing interests, including, of course, the chief one being the SAVE Act. And also the implication for the NDAA is that there is a House member that wants to attach the SAVE Act to the NDAA. Now, as you know, the NDAA is almost sacrosanct in actually getting passed every year on time, one of the few things that does. So to your question, you just have a lot of different things going through the spokes in the wheel right now, and the wheels aren't really turning very fast. And we're, again, as we've talked about, getting to that point where even though we're early in the summer, we're not seeing enough progress on a lot of these legislative issues to get to regular order. And again, we're starting to move down that road to the infamous word of shutdown.
So there's really less than a dozen work days before the summer recess. We still have all of the routine appropriations bills to move through committee. What will you be watching to see if it can actually make it through?
Right. For example, there were supposed to be two pretty basic appropriations bills that Republicans were touting were going to move through last week, and that would have brought the number to 4. But then you had all these wild things that we were just talking about, and that didn't happen. And it was really at the end of last week, there was perhaps some glimmer of hope, at least on the House side, for Speaker Johnson after he went to the White House, spoke with the president. It's clear that he laid out all of the problems that he's dealing with his often unruly conference about how he's not even able to move legislation. I mean, effectively last week, everything was frozen. There was nothing moving on the House floor. So the president put out a message late last week saying, look, I don't want my House members grandstanding, was the word he used, and holding up everything. But at the same time, he is the man that wants the SAVE Act to be passed one way or another. So it's going to be interesting to see how House Speaker Mike Johnson tries to navigate things this week to try to move things forward, because every time something moves forward, it seems to lurch backwards because there's so much attention on this national voter ID bill. And if you just keep trying to attach it to all these pieces of legislation, those pieces of legislation can't move forward. So it is really a tough situation, once again, that the Speaker finds himself in.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks for giving us the honest truth there on the ground.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcast. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from ABC News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 29th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, on disaster response, everyone seems to agree something needs to change. So why hasn't anything changed? Plus, the Postal Service has the green light to take on more government services, but so far, it hasn't. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center has long been a key cog in the Pentagon's efforts to protect sensitive information from leaking to foreign adversaries. But the Pentagon is now ramping up a new evaluation regime under the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, evaluating potentially tens of thousands of contractors that hold sensitive CUI. For more on what the CMMC program means for DIBCAC, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday talked with Nick Del Rosso, the center's director.
Currently, we have a vital dual mission, right, in this realm. And we're here to support the department in that role. These cyber requirements, whether you're talking CMMC or the DFAR 7012, aren't really new, right? So the 7012, which is the basis for the CMMC requirements, goes back probably a good 10 years at this point, where the DIB has had to implement these requirements in support of protecting the CUI for the department. So, in that sense, these requirements have been around, right? And the department's changing some of the requirements as it evolves, and they've created the CMMC program. But the core of that program is the NIST requirements, which date back to the creation of the DFAR 7012. So our mission has been to monitor and enforce compliance with those requirements on the 7012. So we've been performing assessments against the Defense Industrial Base probably a good 6 years at this point, in support of that mission. Now, our role is starting to shift as we transition to CMMC. We're going to be executing what's called level 3 assessments, which is really the NIST SP 800-172, the subset defined by CMMC. So those are going to be new requirements that industry is having to support for those requiring that level of protection. The other parts of that, the CMMC level 2, is essentially what we've been doing on the DFAR 7012.
It's been an interesting journey, to say the least, over the last 10 years since the introduction of the 70-12 clause. And really, I think it was within probably 2 or 3 years that there were various audits and reports that came out that found that while a lot of companies were attesting to meeting the requirements, a lot of companies were, in fact, not meeting many of those NIST requirements that are a part of 7012. So as you've gone through these audits over the last 6 years or so, What have you learned, and how can you carry that
Mhm.
forward with the preparations for level 3 CMMC assessments?
Yeah. So I think what we've learned, by and large, right, industry wants to comply. I think their heart's in the right place. As you go further down the supply chain, right, some of them don't have the technical subject matter experts, right? And without those SMEs, right, it's hard to understand all the nuances of some of the technical jargon. And I think the department's done a pretty good job of trying to abstract, right, and make the requirement broad so it's not driving a specific implementation. But when your small mom and pops go to those standards and try to apply, a lot of the times they will outsource to a consultant or provider. And so what we've seen, right, in some cases, is that maybe the consultant that came in that they contracted with didn't lead them down the right path. So even though they were trying to be compliant, we've identified that, some of these companies gave it the solid effort, but kind of didn't hit the mark. And we've seen that in cases with the consultants or where they've tried to do it themselves. And I think the department has put out a lot of information to help in that regard. And I think that the companies truly want to comply, by and large. And that information is useful, but at the same time, the companies have to try to understand how to implement those requirements. So I think from the consultant side, right, if you're outsourcing and you don't have the expertise in-house, or any IT expertise in-house, right, you want to use the tools that you have at your disposal. And whether it's utilizing some form of AI to review a proposal and try to provide some insight in what they're asking, or really reaching out to your counterparts within industry, right? And we've observed from the security standpoint that industry has been very collaborative in this realm. It's not something that you typically see industry execute on with their competitors, but they've kind of set aside all of the differences when it comes to security, and a lot of them have worked together. So I would encourage those companies that are struggling to reach out to their industry associations, some of their peers, and just have a discussion on what each of them have done to implement the requirements.
And beyond the technical expertise that some of these companies lack, when DIPCAC goes through an audit, are there common areas where companies often struggle in meeting those 110 NIST requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the two biggest that we've seen, right, are the multi-factor authentication and the use of FIPS encryption, right? Particularly, I think FIPS is a challenging one because it relies on your vendor stack from your IT. So if you're using products that don't support it, it's hard to get compliant quickly because you have to switch out that tech stack. Other times the products may support it, but you need to enable the FIPS mode, which requires additional testing because anytime you change a configuration, that may lead to some breakages in the system. So it's something you want to take your time implementing and make sure you test all the requirements. On the multi-factor side, right, there's certainly things like security keys or tokens that could meet the requirement. There's other, I'll say less hardware-based, sometimes requiring a phone, right, or other factors of that authentication. But again, all of it depends on your tech stack that's in place to kind of implement something that works within the scope of your enterprise network.
That's Nick Del Rosso, the director of the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. Watch his full conversation with Justin Doubleday at federalnewsnetwork.com. It's part of our Risk and Compliance Exchange. Up next, on disaster response, everyone seems to agree something needs to change. So why hasn't anything changed? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.